Okay, cool. Looks like there's some people starting to roll in. So thanks everyone for joining us for this webinar this afternoon. I'm just going to run through a quick presentation up front here to kind of walk through what we'll cover in today's webinar, and also talk through a bit of background about Farmax, given this is a getting started webinar to take you through sort of getting set up in Farmax for the very first time. And then for the bulk of the session, we will actually, have a look at setting up a relatively simple farm in Farmax, and take you through some of the steps to kind of get you up and running. The chat and the Q&A section here in Big Marker, which is the platform we host our webinars with, is open. So if you've got any questions along the way, please fire them in the chat. Yeah, let us know where you're tuning in from, and then I'll answer those questions as best I can along the way. And we are recording today's session, so if you want to watch anything back later on, you'll have the chance to do that as well. So a little bit about myself for those that haven't met me before. So my name's Tom Botica. I'm the RP channel specialist here at Farmax. So work predominantly with the rural professional channel, farm consultants, advisors, fertilizer reps, and the like on all things Farmax and FarmIQ. Yeah, a bit about my background. So I grew up on a dairy farm for a short while in Northland, and then a little bit in the Waikato as well. Went and did an ag science degree at Lincoln, and have basically been at Farmax since about the, I don't know, 3 or 4 days after my last exam at Lincoln, probably. So I've been here for a few years now in various different roles, and I have a bit of a kind of diverse role, even today, working with the RP channel, like I said, but also working across managing the various Farmax products that we've got in the market too. So that's a little bit about me. There's my contact details if you ever want to drop me a line as well. Cool. So what is Farmax? For those that haven't come across it before, or hopefully if you're on this webinar, you know a little bit about Farmax already. But Farmax is a modeling and decision support tool developed for New Zealand farmers. We do actually have a few international farmers as well, but New Zealand is well and truly home for Farmax, and it's used for a couple of different purposes. So, as we'll look at today, we're going to set up a farm initially as kind of a base model of the current farm system in Farmax, but we'll also look at one scenario. So, kind of what happens if we change our farm system? How does that impact us physically in terms of the feed budget and production? How does that impact us financially? And how does that impact us environmentally as well? They're kind of some of the core things that Farmax gets used for. In terms of how it works, fundamentally, Farmax is really trying to understand how the feed supply and demand dynamics work on your property. So um, up the top third of that diagram there, that's kind of everything in terms of feed supply on your farm. So, what's your pasture growth rate? How much nitrogen are you applying? What sort of cropping are you doing on the property? And what's the quality of all those different types of feeds? That helps us get a really good understanding of how much feed's going to be available at different times throughout the season. And on the animal demand side, or on the demand side, we've got animal numbers, kind of all things animal performance. So live weight gain, reproductive performance, the breed kind of factors into a few things there as well. And then that allows us to get three main areas of outputs for Farmax. So the first one is a pasture cover. So if we have a good understanding of your feed supply and feed demand, we can start to forecast out what your pasture cover is likely to be doing out into the future. Pretty much everywhere where it's relevant along the way, we have financials attached as well. So, for example, if you purchase in some trade lambs, as we'll do in the farm that we're setting up today, there'll be a market price attached to those lambs. You can override those prices and things, but it'll give you an estimate of how much that's going to cost the farm up front. And then when you turn around and sell those lambs, a few months later at some heavier weights, it's going to give you an estimated sale weight as well. So all of that allows us to help give you some profitability indicators too. And in the past couple of years, we've also started calculating greenhouse gas emissions for your farm. So yeah, anytime you make a change to your farm system that you're kind of analyzing in Farmax, those are the three core areas of kind of outputs that you'll get. And like I say, if you've got any questions about any of the stuff, please drop it in the chat as well. I've already touched on this a little bit, but once you've got an initial base model in Farmax set up, these are some of the questions that, if you've got them floating around in your head, you'll be able to model these in Farmax, get an indication of profit, production, financial implications, and a greenhouse gas number. And Farmax essentially is all about trying to put some unbiased numbers behind some of these decisions and some of these questions you might have before implementing changes on farm. Okay, cool. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and I will bring up Farmax and then we'll get into setting up a farm. Okay, perfect. I think you should all be seeing Farmax now, but any issues, just let me know in the chat. So I'm going to hit open here in Farmax. And this is essentially what you'll be seeing when you open Farmax for the first time and you're kind of yet to set up your farm. Typically in the left-hand column here, you'd have a list of any farms that you've got access to, any scenarios that you've done and so on. But this is kind of starting afresh. So I'm going to come up to new farm at the top left here. This is where you'd put in your farm name. I'm just going to call this Bull Farm 25 March webinar. It's quite a long farm name, but that'll do. I'm going to say that this farm's based in Northland and in the Whangarei district, which is actually where I'm coming to you from today. You can put in a longitude and latitude in Farmax, so I'm just going to go with its rough guess there for Northland, but you can either type in your address or kind of move this pin around and zoom in. That will impact some of the pasture growth rate forecasts that you'll get from a tool called Pasture Vibe that we work with. That's a topic for another webinar probably, but it will have an influence on that. This farm's 200 hectares. That's an effective area. I'm going to untick that this is a real farm because it's just a training one, and I'll hit create farm. Perfect. So that's created my farm on the left-hand side there. Next step to get started with putting in some of your information is to create a new Farmax file. So I'll click new file in the middle column there, and I'll call this something like current system. You might set up like a 23-24 season budget or something like that in here as well, but just going to set up my current system. Over time, you'll end up with a lot of different files there with various scenarios and previous years and things like that. But for now, we're just getting started. So we'll go current system. And in terms of navigating around Farmax, as you'll see throughout the webinar, there's sort of various different levels that you work through in Farmax. So up at this top level, there's not a lot of data input really that happens, but it is where a lot of the default values are stored away for your property, and a lot of the reporting can be found. So for example, if I wanted to add a new crop or feed that I then went and fed out as a supplement or put in as a crop, this is where all these default values live. So I'm going to be putting in a turnip crop later. So if I wanted to check the default yield and cost to grow the crop and so on, that's where all these kind of things live. But I'm not going to make a lot of adjustments here just yet. I'm not going to kind of mess with the default values for today. I will go down to the block, however. So we can start entering now, obviously, all your land information at this block level. If you have different blocks that have quite different pasture growth rates or anything like that, you will need to set those up as multiple different blocks in Farmax. We do a little bit of individual paddock stuff, but not a lot. Blocks and areas of the farm that might be irrigated versus dry land or hills and flats would tend to split out, but that's about kind of as granular as we get. So in terms of the properties for block one here, I'm not really going to make any changes. I'm just going to leave it at a medium quality pasture type. Here through to pasture growth. And it's really just a case of kind of working through each of these data input screens one by one at the various elements of the farm we'll work through today. So for pasture growth, a lot of farms will have a rough idea of what their pasture growth rate is, but many will not. For this particular farm, I am just going to pull from our library actually. So if I go up to library here, I'll get a few different regions. So Northern North Ireland rather. I'm going to pick the Northland Fertile pasture growth rate curve. You can flick through and have a look at some of the other kind of defaults we've got there, but I'm going to go Northland Fertile, apply, and that will bring through that default pasture growth rate curve. You can bring it through a pasture growth rate curve from the library and modify it kind of as required. If you just want to use that as a starting point and maybe make some adjustments, but for today, I'm just going to bring through that one. Continuing down to crops, this particular farm does a little bit of cropping. So we have one summer crop, which is bulb turnips. So I'm just going to come up here to new crop, pick bulb turnip from the list there, and then start populating some of the details down the bottom. So this is a 5-hectare crop, 15 tonne of dry matter per hectare is the yield I want to budget on. And this area is basically out of the grazing rotation, kind of not in pasture from typically the 20th of October through to the 1st of April. And then it's followed by new pasture, which will just bring through a regrassing expense. So yeah, that's all the info I need to add in at the stage for my turnip crop. We do also put in any hay and silage that's done on the farm in the screen as well. So this particular farm does typically cut some silage, so I'm going to come in here and add that as well. You can kind of drag these blocks around to change the dates if that's easier, but I'm just going to sort of manually type some of the values in. So 15 hectares. That yield is way too big, so we're going to drop that to 3 tonne per hectare. And this is going to be from the 10th of October until the 20th of November, and then that's going to be cut. So that is all the cropping set up. A little bit later on in the session, we'll come back to how those crop yields are allocated, but that's something we'll touch on later, like I say. I'll keep moving through. The last data input screen I'm going to look at here for the land is nitrogen. There's a little bit of nitrogen used on this farm. So again, new nitrogen, our product list is relatively short at this stage. If you do want to add different nitrogen fertilizer products, you can go up to the top level. There's a fertilizer section out there, similar to the crops and feeds that I touched on before. But for this stage, urea is going to do the trick. So I'll add that in, and this particular screen is structured very similarly to the crops. So it's just a case of putting in some of the details here. 75 hectares in this case. We're going to do 20 units or 20 kilos of nitrogen per hectare. And that is on the 10th of October. Cool. And that's about all there is to it in terms of putting fertilizer on. In terms of putting fertilizer on in general in Farmax, it is just nitrogen we're worried about. And just nitrogen to pasture as well. You'll see it's kind of blocked out some of that crop area down the bottom. So just what's in your sort of pasture grazing rotation is all we're really worried about there. And that's basically all the land set up for this particular farm. It's going to be relatively simple, just one 200 hectare block. If you had multiple blocks in Farmax, you'd essentially just rinse and repeat that process. You can right click on the top level and add in your various block types. So you can just keep adding multiple blocks of pasture if you need to. If you've got some forestry blocks, you can add those in. If you've got other sort of not effective area like, races and shed area and those kind of small components of the farm area, you can add those in as well. But for this particular farm, just the single block. So we'll move through to stock. Going to right click on that top level again, hit new enterprise, and beef is what I want to pick here. You can have multiple beef enterprises, as we call them. So In this example, I've got bull beef, but you might want to break this out into, say, bull beef, dairy grazers, breeding cows, if you've got kind of a lot of different beef stock classes. That way you'll get separate stock recs, separate reporting for them. But for this particular farm, just the single enterprise of bull beef. And within an enterprise, we can start adding our mobs. So I'm going to right click on bull beef, add a new mob of bull calves. And I'll also add a new mob of 1-year bulls. They're the two age groups I'm going to work with. In both cases, they are going to be Friesian bulls. So if I go to the calves here and properties, I get the chance to edit the breed. So I'll pop Friesian in for them. Go to the 1-year bulls and do the same. And in what we call long-term mode in Farmax, which essentially is just trying to model like a status quo, typical kind of a year for a given farm, we can age animals through. So that means in any modeling that we do, if we have, say, 100 bull calves at the end of a season, that means we're going to open up with 100 one-year-old bulls at the start of the following season. So we can set up those aging links in here. In this case, our 1-year bulls are going to be aged from bull calves. It might be a little bit hard to see depending on your screen, but it has yellowed out some of these fields because they're now all set from the properties of that kind of bull calf mob. So if I wanted to change my breed to something else, essentially it's picking that info up from the calves here, from that kind of age group down. So those are my two mobs set up, and aging linkages all done. So now it's basically a case of trying to put in all my stock numbers and their performance. So I'll start off with bull calves because that's where things kind of kick off. So bull calves and then numbers. This is where I can come in and basically start adding in my stock transactions, kind of the budgeted things I want to have happen on the property here. For this particular farm, we're going to plan to buy 1,000 bull calves in December. So I've just come into December under buy, plug in 1,000, and that's created an event down the bottom here where it's kind of tried to estimate what it thinks that might look like. So it's just gone 1st of December. I'll leave that as is. I'm going to buy them at 100 kgs, and that's put a estimated price as well. Next up, I'm just going to budget on a few deaths. For simplicity, I'm just going to lump them all into a really bad day in January here, but you can spread those out kind of as required. And since we've set up that aging link, these 980 bull calves will now flow through to be our opening number in here for our 1-year-old bulls. So we can start to set up the transactions for the 1-year bulls now to complete kind of the full system. So for that, I'm going to add a few more deaths, so 10 more deaths in August. Again, all on a really bad day on the 16th of the month, but you can kind of spread those out as required, depending on how you want to budget. And then I'm going to set up a couple of sales in December and January. So in December, I'll come through to sell, new sale. And you can set up sort of rules in here. So if you've got a certain live weight gain target or anything like that, you could say above a certain, target of say 500 kgs or 600 kgs for the bulls. In this case, I'm going to sell the top 50%. And that's on the 16th of December. I'm actually going to sell them to the works, which will bring through slightly different prices. That carcass weight's really low at the moment. I'll come back and fix that shortly when I put in some of the live weight gain performance. But that's at least got the sale transaction in there. And then I'm going to sell basically everything that's left the next month in January. So come down to January, new sale, and we do just have an option here to sell all, which will get rid of everything. So that is kind of all the stock transactions set up for that relatively simple bull enterprise. And that really just leaves the weights for this mob. The kind of the two things that will have a really big impact on your feed budget in Farmax are the stock numbers and the weights. So we've done sort of part one of that, and we'll now have a look at live weights. So I'm just going to reference some info I've got on another screen here and just kind of whack these numbers in relatively quickly. And you'll see some of the weights changing here. 4.4.3. If you've got live weight measurements that you've done on your property, that's obviously the best way to kind of work backwards and figure out what expected weight gains you want to have in your budget moving forward. But that weight, 179 at the end of the season, will flow through to my 1-year bulls. So they start off this year at 179. And again, I'll just nudge some of these weights up a little bit. 6.6. Cool. And if I come back through to numbers here, we're still, oh, there we go. So that's lifted up some of our weights here. So we're actually still a little bit on the light side there. And sorry, I think I set that to works earlier, but that sale should be store. There we go. That's a little bit tidier. So that's lifted up some of the weights for those animals, and that will have changed the per head prices and things that I'm expected to get as well. It will have also quite significantly shifted the demand that it's calculating for those animals for my feed budget too. So that's all the beef set up. I only have one more enterprise for this particular farm, and that is some trade lambs. So I'm going to right click on the top level, new enterprise of sheep. I'll call this trade lambs. Again, you can set up multiple sheep enterprises if you have, say, breeding ewes with all the various replacement mobs and things, or if you have grazing hoggets or trade lambs through the summer, or winter lambs or anything like that. You can split them all out kind of as required. But for this, we've just got the reasonably simple single enterprise here. And we're actually only going to have one mob in there as well. So if I right click on trade lambs and add a mob of mixed lambs. Cool. So in terms of breed and opening number here, I'm not going to change anything. I'm just going to leave them as Romney. This number here, this is as of the first day of the season. So you'll see at the top right there, I'm setting up like a 24-25 season budget here. I'm going to purchase these in after July. Then these animals won't be born in July. So leaving that opening number as 0 will be fine. So I'll jump through to numbers. And I'm going to buy 1,000 lambs in December. I'll plug in 1,000. Again, it'll try and have a bit of a guess at the date and weight and things. That weight's going to be too light, so I'm going to purchase these at more like 28 kilos. Again, that'll try and have a guess at a market price at that time for you too. I'm going to buy actually a further 400 a couple months later in February. We're going to say that those are 30 kgs at that time. And then I'm going to use some rules to set up kind of some sales here. So from, let's say, January, I'll put it a new sale. And for this particular farm, I'm just going to set up a relatively simple plan. You can get quite detailed and put multiple transactions per month, but I'm just going to put one sale a month, and each time I want to sell any lamb that's above 40 kilos in live weight. So to do that, I'm going to go sell above, plug in 40 and hit enter. It's only estimated that like 10 lambs are going to be ready. Again, I'll come back or I'll go on shortly to edit some of the live weight gains and bump them up. That should mean dramatically, more lambs are going to be at 40 kilos and will get sold. So that'll change. But I just want to get these rules established first. So come into February, sell above 40 kgs. March, sell above 40 kgs. And April, I'm just going to sell all, which right now is actually most of them. And again, the carcass weight's going to be really low, but I'll clean that up in just a sec. So that's got all the rules set up there. Not too many lambs going in those early months, but we'll come through to live weights and clean that up. So just for the purpose of this exercise, I'm going to leave the live weight gains here really simple. I'm just going to say that I think these lambs can do 200 grams a day, kind of right through the period of time that we've got them. Again, if you're setting this up for your own farm, you'll want to be a bit more detailed. But just for argument's sake, let's say we can do 200 grams a day right through. That should have pretty dramatically shifted our sale pattern. There we go. So I think that was only selling 10 lambs before in January. It's now selling 160. So it's recalculated all of those. We've got some, some healthier carcass weights at sale time for those animals. And everything is gone by April. So that's a relatively simple little trade lamb enterprise we've got set up there. And that's essentially everything on the stock side we're going to look at for this initial setup. So if you've got any questions on anything we've gone through there, just pop them in the chat. In the meantime, I'm just going to set up the last kind of couple of things here, and then this base farm is essentially ready to go. So one area we haven't looked at yet is just feeding out our crop and supplement. So to do that, I'm going to come up to the top level and then supplements. And you'll see my two crops that I put in earlier sitting in here, so bulb turnip and pasture silage. And in both cases, we've got some yield coming through. So I've got 75 tonne of dry matter for my turnip crop coming through as produced. And it's essentially just a case of putting in the number of tonnes that are going to be fed in any given month. So in the case of the turnips, I'm going to feed this over January and February, 37.5 tonne in each of those 2 months. And if I go through to silage, I've again got a little bit coming through here, so I got 45 tonne. For silage, I'm actually going to say that I also had 45 tonne on hand at opening. So if you've got any inventory values you want to pop in, you can do that too. And with the silage, since it's a different sort of type of crop, it gives me a few more options. So I can sell it if I want to. I can buy more. With the turnip, pretty much all it would let me do is feed it. That is actually all I'm going to do here for the silage, but you have got some other options there if you need to. So I'm going to feed this mostly through winter, 20 tonne in July, 25 tonne in August. That leaves me with no silage on hand kind of at the back end of winter, but then I've got a little bit more coming through as produced in the spring, and I close the year with 45 tonne. So if I go through to the pasture screen here for Farmax, this is sort of the end result of all of the things that we've put in so far in the session. So that top graph there is just my forecast average pasture cover through the season. That's what the green line is showing there. The grey line is showing something we call minimum cover. So that's essentially based on your stock numbers and their demand and live weight gain and so on at any point in time throughout the year. It's basically saying you need at least this level of pasture cover in order to meet those production targets. So for this particular farm, we've got more cover than the minimum requirement for the full season. So up the top right there, Farmax tells us that this particular system is feasible, which is great. If you have any areas where you're kind of redlining here, it might just mean that you need to go back and review your live weight gains or your stock numbers, or maybe even your pasture growth rates, just to bring your feed budget kind of more into line. But this particular farm's looking reasonably tidy. So that will also fill out a few of these other reports, say the physical summary. It'll give us some stats on how much pasture is consumed per hectare, what our production is, what our stocking rate is in stock units per hectare, sheep to beef ratios, which this farm's obviously pretty heavy on the beef side. And although we haven't really gone into the financials in this particular session, it'll start at least giving us an estimate of financial performance as well, just using default expenses. If you do want to edit that, you can dive into the expenses section there. If people have questions on that in the session, we can maybe dive into it. But for now, I'm just going to leave those as kind of default values. Um, Cool, and that is essentially at least the physical side. Like I said, we haven't gone in too much into financials, but that's essentially the physical side of a Farmax model all set up. So just one final thing I'll run through for today, and then we'll get to any questions if you've got some. I'll save and close out there because that is all done. Go back to open, and I should see current system sitting in there. Last saved by me at 1 p.m. Last thing I'll just walk you through in this session is how to run a scenario. That's one of the main things Farmax gets used for is, okay, we've set up our current system, we get some nice reports, Farmax says we're feasible, that's cool. But what if I want to look at some different options? How's that potentially going to impact the farm business? So best way to do that is to set up actually a kind of a separate second Farmax file. That current system one probably won't need a whole lot of editing ever again, really. That's a good kind of long-term model that we'll set up. But we can use it and take advantage of all the data in there to calculate some different options. So if I right-click on current system, you get an option in there called duplicate file. And this is what you can use to make new scenarios. So I'm going to set one up here called no trade lambs, and have a look at what happens if we just clear out that enterprise altogether. So you can give that kind of a name depending on what you're looking at any given point in time, whether it's a crop change or a nitrogen change or some other change. But in this case, we'll go with no trade lambs. Open that up. And now I can kind of go ahead and make the relevant changes for my scenario. And pretty much at all times when you're looking at making different scenarios and run through different options in Farmax, you want to keep an eye on what's happening with your pasture cover. I could make a whole raft of changes here and it might look really profitable, but at all times I want to make sure that from a feed budget perspective, the system is still feasible. I still have enough kind of feed to do what I'm trying to do. So up above print there, and you can do this with pretty much any report in Farmax. We've got a pop-out button that'll just drop this into a separate window, and I can keep an eye on that pasture cover kind of the whole time as I make changes. So for example, if I come through to trade lambs and just right click and delete them to get rid of them altogether, you should see that my pasture cover will change. It's jumped up quite a bit, particularly through summer, because I've just got rid of all of those animals from my budget. So we've got quite a bit more pasture to work with through the season there. Given that I've got no lambs on through the summer, I'm also going to make a couple of other changes, particularly because I've got a lot of feed through that summer period now. The main one is actually I'm going to delete out my turnip crop. That's mainly going to be a feed that the lambs are working with, I guess. So we'll clear that out altogether. I'll go delete. You'll see that's actually nudged my cover up again, initially just because I've got a bit more area growing grass now that we don't have that area out for crop. But I'm just going to have to make sure I go through to my supplements, and I'm still attempting to feed about 75 tonne of turnip here, even though I'm not producing any. So I've got a weird kind of negative inventory happening here. So I'm going to clear out that that turnip from being fed, and you'll see my my pasture cover has come down a little bit. It's still pretty high there, but it's come back to earth a little bit. Given that it's still pretty high, I might just make one final change. Let's say I want to take out a little bit of hay through summer, given that those lambs aren't coming on any longer. I'll go through to the block again and crops, new crop. And let's do, we should have hay in the list here somewhere, I think. Hay big. Cool. And in terms of areas, you'll see by default it's put in 50 hectares, which, judging by my cover there, is way too much. We're suddenly not looking that feasible. So let's just set up some dates first, and then we can play around with the area. So let's do, say, um, 1st of December through to late Feb. How long a period's that? You can play around with dates and areas and things here, but that will do for today. 15 bales a hectare. Obviously, you can play around with your production as well. And let's start seeing what area we can kind of get away with. So if I drop this down to 30 hectares, you'll see we're suddenly now feasible. If I was doing like 60 hectares, it's not looking very flash. So you can play around here with what you think's reasonable. If I want to stay around like a 2,000-ish cover going into next season, looks like about 20 hectares is kind of the magic number. Could even do a little bit less probably. Just depends on kind of where you want your cover to sit, but that's how it would look, at least if you wanted to use kind of hay as an option there. So that essentially is that scenario done. So I've cleared out the lambs, we're no longer growing turnips, and we're putting in a little bit of hay. So I will save and close out. And the final step really is just to see how it stacks up against our current system. So if I go back to open here, I'm just going to highlight both of these at the same time. So you can just hold Control or Shift on your keyboard and highlight those. Hit open. And then we get this new level at the top left here called All Farms, which will essentially stack up those two different options against one another for us. So in the red or pink kind of color there, you'll see we've got our current system. And the green is the projected cover without the lambs and without the crop and making a little bit of hay. So you'll see we've got quite a bit more pasture cover pretty much all season with that scenario option we looked at. And there's a whole bunch of reports here you can work through to see some of the production changes and so on. I won't go through all of them in this webinar. And again, these are just some default values, but this will give you a bit of a feel for what it can show you on the financial side as well. So our sheep revenue has gone down about $34,000 because we obviously have no sheep on the property any longer. We do have about 19 grand's worth of hay sitting in the inventory, sitting in the shed, I guess, at the end of the season. So there is a value attributed to that. We've spent about 7 grand extra on making that hay. We've saved a little bit of money on not putting in that forage crop, which was the turnips, and a little less regrassing. And there's some other changes around the edges that it's estimated based on kind of stocking rate declines as well. And overall, that's got our farm profit before tax down about $9,500. So this is the type of thing Farmax users kind of get into a lot with Farmax. It's just trying to analyze these different options and yeah, get a good feel for what it might look like before they make that change. Cool. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen there. It doesn't look like we've got any questions at this stage, so I think we might call the session there. Like I said towards the start there, we will have a recording of this that's sent out, so feel free to have a look through that. Again, if you do have any questions, my contact details and so on are in that initial presentation as well. But yeah, really appreciate you joining us, and that's all we've got for this one. So have a good day.